He was born in Toronto and joined the Young Liberals while in high school. That doesn't sound like it ought to be part of the bio of our current Prime Minister, but it is. Here to help us better understand Stephen Harper, the person, we're joined in the nation's capital by John Ibbitson, writer-at-large at the Globe and Mail and the author of Stephen Harper, which, John, is a great, great read. Congratulations on getting it published. How are you enjoying the campaign so far?
It's a whole lot of fun, Steve.
Isn't it, though? Let's, just before we start talking, do a couple of bio highlights here from Stephen Harper's life. He was born on the 30th of April, 1959. He grew up in Leaside, Ontario, a suburb of Toronto, basically East York today, not too far from this very studio. He is the first Canadian Prime Minister to grow up in a suburb. He is one of three brothers. His father was an accountant. His two brothers are accountants. John, I have to tell you, one of the very first lines you have in this book really struck me, and that's where I want to start. You write, "There may never have been a politician elected to high office so temperamentally unsuited to it as Stephen Harper." How so?
He is a deeply introverted man. You talked about his father and his three brothers. Joe Harper had a profound influence on his sons. And one of those influences was temperament, because Joe Harper was a deeply introverted man. And I interviewed Robert Harper, Stephen's brother, who is also introverted. And Stephen Harper himself is a very closed person, a person who has difficulty handling crowds, who has difficulty handling other people, for that matter, who does not like travel, who does not like to have his routine disrupted, who likes to wake up in the same place at the same time and eat the same meals. These are not qualities that we associate with politicians. And so he has struggled against that his entire political life, trying to fit his own inclinations and his own nature into the job that he's found himself in.
It's interesting. He's been Prime Minister for almost a decade, and I have asked, having read the book, numerous people, how many siblings does Stephen Harper have? And I have yet to find a person. No, I know you know, but the answer that I have got from all the people I have asked is, I don't know. And those who think they know actually don't know. How is it possible this man could be PM for so long and we know so little about his background?
That's the very reason I wrote the biography. I didn't know much about him after spending more than a decade covering him as leader of the Canadian Alliance and then as of the Conservative Party and then as Prime Minister. He has not opened himself up to anyone. Again, it's part of that very closed, introverted disposition. And on the one hand, what you see is what you get. It's not as though people have no idea what Stephen Harper's like. I think most of us have a very good idea what it's like. But we don't really have much of a sense of why he is what he is, how he got to where he now is, and what it's like to be inside that very, very small space that includes Stephen Harper, his family, and his small circle of friends, the people who are inside the wall with everybody else on the planet outside it.
Well, it's interesting. We all call him Stephen now, but as you point out, for the first, 40 years or so of his life, he was always Steve Harper. Why and when did he become Stephen?
In 1993, he was running for the Reform Party in Calgary. He was very young. He was still in his early 30s. And he wanted to have some gravitas. He had run in '88 as Steve Harper for Reform, and of course didn't win. Nobody won for Reform in that election. But in '93, he was running again. His chances looked good, and he thought that Stephen would add some gravitas to the name. But Laureen Harper changed. She calls him Stephen now, but a lot of his friends still call him Steve.
Stephen Harper as a teenager in high school, what was he like?
Well, he was nerdy, you'll be surprised to hear. He had asthma, and that kept him from being very active in sports. So although he did run in track and field, was decent at it, because he wasn't good at participating in sports, he became an observer of sports, and he became obsessed with collecting sports statistics. You know, of course, that he ended up writing a book about the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I think that formed him. He was an exceptionally good student, at the top of his class in almost every course. But someone who observed and took notes rather than someone who led as part of a team. And again, I think if you think of Stephen Harper we know today, that makes perfect sense.
Well, he did what a lot of kids hope to do when they graduate from high school, and that is, if you're good enough, you go to Trinity College at the University of Toronto. He tried that. How did that work out?
Well, and that, to my mind, and in the biography, is the single most important thing that happened to him in his life. He lasted 2 weeks, maybe 3. Here we had a smart kid from a middle-class suburban family, the first of his family to go to university. He met the sons and daughters of the Central Canadian elite at that closed private institution of Trinity College, and he fled from it. Not only did he flee from it, he was in a state. His father phoned a friend in Calgary, in Edmonton, and said, "My son just quit school. I don't know what to do with him. Have you got a job for him?" And Gord Shaw said, "Yeah, we got a job in the mailroom." So by the end of that week, Steve Harper had left Ontario, had gone to Edmonton, and was working as a clerk in a mailroom at Imperial Oil. And he did it for 3 years. 3 years. Imagine someone as smart as Stephen Harper working in a clerical job for 3 years. But he was that lost, he was that traumatized, and he was that determined that he wouldn't go back to university until he knew why he was going back and what he was going to do with it. It speaks both to the sense of alienation and trauma that experience imposed on him, and also to the strength of will that he was going to get through it, but he was going to get through it on his terms.
That really changed his life, though, didn't it? He went from being a Toronto Liberal to a Western Conservative because of that move to Edmonton, yes?
Absolutely. He arrived just as the national energy policy was being imposed in Alberta. He went from loving Pierre Trudeau and admiring him to hating and despising him. He went from being a Liberal to being a Conservative, but not any Conservative, not a sort of a red Tory, not a Joe Clark or Brian Mulroney Conservative, a real red meat Calgary Conservative. That, more than anything else, formed him and forged the kind of political ideology, political personality that he has to this day.
Does this also represent the time of his life where he, as you would put it, I guess, gathers a rather intense dislike of the so-called Laurentian elites? And explain that, if you would.
Well, I'm glad you said it, not me. But yes, when he went to Trinity College, it was the sons and daughters of the Laurentian elite that he met and that he rejected. These are the political, bureaucratic, financial, media, academic, artistic elites who live in the big cities in central Canada, Toronto, Ottawa, and Montreal principally, and who at that time especially ran the country and ran it mostly by consensus. When he went to Trinity, he had a choice. He could join that elite. It's not impermeable. Many people from outside the circle are able to enter into it, and he could have, but instead he fled. He fled to a place where the elites had no power and influence, where there was tremendous resentment towards them, and became very much a leader of the movement of opposition to those Laurentian elites, a movement that he led to victory in 2006.
Well, ironically, if he'd stayed at Trinity longer, he might have met Nigel Wright, who was there at the same time and eventually became his controversial chief of staff. Let me read an excerpt from your book. This is about Preston Manning, who, of course, founded the Reform Party and with whom Stephen Harper worked very closely until they had a falling out. Manning and Harper got along well in those early months simply because each respected the other's grasp of and approach to policy, and because neither was in the least bit interested in anything else about the other. Virtually all of our discussions were at the policy level, Manning recalled later. Sandra, my wife, used to remark, "Do you guys ever talk about anything other than policy?" The real answer was no. That was the entire basis of our relationship. Neither would have called the other a friend. Can you take that example and extrapolate from that the kind of relationships Stephen Harper has in his political life?
Yes. People say that Stephen Harper isn't loyal. He is loyal, but only to those who are on the inside, this very, very tiny, small, closed circle of family and friends. Everybody else is just, it's a transactional relationship. How can this person benefit me? How can I advance myself? How can I have my interests served? And that was very much the case with Manning. I mean, one of the things in the book that it was the thing that surprised me more than anything else as I was researching and talking to people and interviewing. Stephen Harper is constitutionally incapable of deferring to authority. He couldn't do it with his teachers. He couldn't do it with Preston Manning. He wanted things done a certain way, his way. And when others wouldn't do things his way, he left, as he left Manning, as he quit the Reform Party. It should have ruined him. We all have to defer. We all have to get along. We all have to kowtow to the boss every now and then. But Harper wouldn't do it, couldn't do it, was constitutionally incapable of doing it. And it should have destroyed him. It should have ruined him. But instead, He found his way to the one job in the country where nobody tells you what to do, and that's Prime Minister.
So in that respect, he is ideally suited to this job because he doesn't have to take anything from anybody. Fair to say?
Fair to say, except even the Prime Minister of Canada, the electorate, and a couple of others. For example, who are two people, perhaps the top two people, who do not have to, who are not subordinate to the Prime Minister of Canada? Indeed, two people to whom the Prime Minister of Canada is, in a way, subordinate. I would contend that one is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, and the other is the President of the United States. How well does Stephen Harper get along with the Chief Justice and with the President?
I think we know the answer to that question. He's had a very public fight with the Chief Justice, and I guess his relationship with President Obama is, well, go ahead, you characterize it.
Well, correct on the surface and hostile in the background. This was a man who told the president, just as a 28-year-old Stephen Harper told Preston Manning, you're doing everything wrong, and unless you listen to me, you're never going to become Prime Minister. So too, the Prime Minister of Canada said to the President of the United States, you must approve the Keystone Pipeline. It's a no-brainer, and I will not take no for an answer. Well, how did that work out?
It hasn't yet for Stephen Harper. Let's do a couple of other quotes here. Here's Tom Flanagan, who was his one-time chief of staff and, as we know, has had a very public falling out with the PM since. He can be suspicious, secretive, and vindictive, prone to sudden eruptions of white-hot rage over meaningless trivia, at other times falling into week-long depressions in which he is incapable of making decisions. That was Flanagan. In your own book, you've got Preston Manning saying he did have that tendency to go into his own funks every once in a while. Can we have some examples of the above?
Well, they happened routinely. They happened, for example, after the 2004 election, when he thought he was going to win and become prime minister, and lost and disappeared for a while. It happened going further back. In 1993, he almost didn't run. He was so angry at Preston Manning and had so withdrawn from the Reform Party that he had decided not to run, to give up his candidacy in Calgary. And the only reason he did run is the one person in the world at that time who could tell him, and who he listened to, his own father, Joe, said, you've committed to run, you have to run. He doesn't, by the way, suffer from depression. Depression is a clinical condition, and the condition of depression is not necessarily related to external events. You can be depressed when everything is seemingly going along swimmingly for you. When Stephen Harper goes into a funk, there's a very good reason for the funk. That said, he's gotten better at controlling it, managing it, and coming out of it. For example, the very worst time he's ever had as prime minister, during the Senate expenses scandal, it was rough, and he was clearly in a funk. But he got through it because he realized that either he got through it or he would lose the prime ministership, he would lose the government. And so when he absolutely has to, he can control it.
What role does his wife play, Laureen, in A, as a political advisor, or B, getting him out of those funks?
In one of them, for example, when he went into a funk over the fact that he thought he was about to be defeated during the coalition crisis of 2008, it was Laureen who sort of steadied him and said, "No, come on, you've got to get through this. You can win this. You can do it." She is a partner politically as well as in life, as well as the mother of their children, as well as wife. It is a very symbiotic relationship. Look, Laureen is the extrovert, the friendly one, the one that gets along with crowds, the one that everybody likes. But as people say who are close to them, she's more intensely partisan than he is. And if you get on the wrong side of Laureen Harper, you're going to wish you'd never been born. He also has a habit. If there's an 8 o'clock meeting in which the Prime Minister is briefed, if he walks into that meeting waving a piece of paper, the chances are it's from Mrs., as she's called, and he does not return to 24 Sussex Drive unless whatever she has raised in that paper gets answered. She's a very powerful and formidable presence within the life of the government and within the life of the Prime Minister, obviously.
Well, I guess we should point out, as I learned in your book, they met at a Reform Party conference, so clearly her interest in politics was equal to his, yes?
Yes, although one of the things I discovered, Stephen Harper had a girlfriend before Lorraine Teskey. In fact, they were engaged to be married. And even after it broke up, they remained friends. But Stephen Harper, as you know, ran against his own mentor, Jim Hawkes, in the riding of Calgary. I forget which riding it was in Calgary, in 1988. because Harper was running for the Reform Party and Hawkes was running for the Progressive Conservatives. Hawkes, of course, trounced him. But Lorraine Tetsky worked on Jim Hawkes' campaign. She didn't know Stephen Harper at the time. So in the very first campaign that Stephen Harper ran in, his own future wife ran against him.
John, let's finish up on this. I know when Paul Wells was here talking about his book, The Longer I'm Prime Minister, one of the questions I asked him was, do you like Stephen Harper? Okay, you've written a whole book about the man now. He'll clearly go down in history as one of the most consequential conservative prime ministers ever, but I want to know whether you like him.
One of the things I say in the book, I address the question is Stephen Harper cruel? And I finally answer it after an entire chapter debating it. No, he's not cruel, just very, very tough. I like Stephen Harper. I wouldn't have spent 3 years of my life writing a book about him if I didn't like him. At least I wouldn't be a very nice person, I don't think. But then I like politicians. I like Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin. I liked Mike Harris when I covered him at Queen's Park. I think politicians, rather like reporters, can be vain and greedy and arrogant. But on the other hand, they get into the business trying to make the country, leave it better than they found it. I think Stephen Harper got into politics hoping to leave Canada better than he found it. I think in the main that he succeeded. So to that extent, sure, I like him fine.
Gotcha. That's John Ibbitson, author of Stephen Harper. It's a great read. John, thanks for joining us on TVO tonight.
My pleasure, Steve.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit supporttvo.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.